And thanks to you at home for joining us this hour. You know, it has become a regular feature of our lives now as Americans that we have a president who says very disruptive, very shocking things. Now, frequently the president says these shocking things beyond the hearing of the outside world. We just get reporting about them, right? Like the time last year when he asked a room full of lawmakers in the Oval Office about immigration policies for countries including Haiti and El Salvador and several different countries in Africa. The president reportedly asked those lawmakers in the Oval Office, quote, "Why are we having all these people from bleep hole countries come here?" He said that inside the White House, inside the Oval Office, and the multiple people who heard him say it were so shocked that his comments ended up making their way outside the White House into the national news. Now, depending on your perspective, what the president said that day was, embarrassing or unfortunate, or maybe it was just tough talk, depending on how you think about it. But he said it. People around him who heard it were shocked enough about it that they told reporters about it. He weathered the criticism that poured in after. That's one of the ways this happens around him. There was also the time during the campaign when it emerged that he'd been riding around in 2005 on the Access Hollywood bus talking about grabbing women by the privates and how they let you do that when you're a star. Again, it was, in that case, that was on tape. And it was, again, something shocking. We had the audio tape of that. It was shocking to hear a major party nominee for the office of President of the United States talking like that. But again, he said it. That tape sat around for a long time. It eventually came out during the campaign. There was a torrent of criticism. In that case, he actually apologized for it. But once again, he weathered the criticism that poured in after those remarks. I mean, mostly what happens is, president says shocking thing. It upends 1 or 2 or 3 or 10 news cycles, depending on how shocking. And then he weathers it, and then gradually equilibrium gets restored until new shocking things said by president. Rinse, cycle, repeat. On occasion, though, our president with this tendency to say shocking things, on occasion, he manages to say something that is not merely shocking. It turns out to be consequential. On occasion, he managed to say something so shocking that it isn't just short-term disruptive, it maybe changes the course of history because it's something that sticks and it's something big.
I was going to fire Comey. There's no good time to do it, by the way.
Because in your letter you said I accepted their recommendation,
yeah, well,
so you had already made the decision.
I was going to fire regardless of recommendation.
So there was really
he made a recommendation. He's highly respected, very good guy, very smart guy. The Democrats like him, the Republicans like him. He made a recommendation, but regardless of recommendation, I was going to fire Comey, knowing there was no good time to do it. And in fact, when I decided to just do it, I said to myself, I said, this Russia thing with Trump and Russia is a made-up story.
What the president told NBC News' Lester Holt that day, saying he had the Russia investigation in mind when he decided, I know there's no good time to do it, but I got to fire the FBI director. When he said that one, yeah, that was shocking, but that was more than shocking. I mean, first of all, the president said that in public on audio and videotape. He came right out and said it to the anchor of a major national newscast on tape. And when he said that about firing the FBI director because of Russia, that stuck because he raised a lasting legal question. I mean, 6 weeks before, James Comey had confirmed for Congress that the FBI was investigating the Trump campaign and whether it worked with the Russian government during Russia's attempt to queer the 2016 election in Trump's benefit. Comey revealed to the House Intelligence Committee on March 20th, 2017, that the investigation at the FBI was underway. The president then fired James Comey on May 9th, and it was 2 days later that the president explained what he had not previously made public.
And in fact, when I decided to just do it, I said to myself, I said, this Russia thing with Trump and Russia is a made-up story.
So we are used to this cycle, right? From back through the campaign, maybe even from back before the campaign, maybe just him as a public figure, but certainly him as a political figure. We're used to this cycle, right? Trump says, shocking thing. People are shocked. Some level of criticism levied at Trump because of shocking thing he said. Trump weathers criticism. Country moves on. Like, we're used to this cycle, right? I think the president does it on purpose a lot of time because he enjoys that cycle. But when he said this thing about firing Comey because of the Russia investigation, I mean, that wasn't just your typical shocking thing. That was potentially an admission of criminal behavior, an admission specifically of criminal intent. Right? What the president did there was he drew a connection between the investigation into his campaign about Russia and his decision to fire the man in charge of that investigation. And so that raised the question as to whether or not the president had just confessed to the criminal intent necessary to prove criminal obstruction of justice. The firing of James Comey and, to a certain extent, what the president said about why he did it ultimately led to the appointment of special counsel Robert Mueller and the Mueller investigation to look into, among other things, whether or not the president obstructed justice. And now we've got these multiple expanding investigations still going on in Congress about Mueller's findings and the standoffs over witnesses and subpoenas. Right? All of that began with a shocking thing said by the president that stuck, right? It's still stuck to him, despite his best efforts to shake it off. Because of that investigation, we now have, memorialized in the Mueller report, the gleeful response from the Trump campaign when the Russians came calling in 2016 with an offer of dirt on Hillary Clinton. Right? Donald Trump Jr. wrote back almost at once, "If it is what you say, I love it." Right? A foreign adversary, longtime foreign adversary, comes calling, offering one presidential campaign dirt on their opponent. The president's the future president's own eldest son says, "Oh yeah, if the Russians have dirt to offer on our opponent, I love it. Let's hear it. Let's set up the meeting." Right? Donald Trump Jr. got that message in June 2016. Today, 3 years later, June 2019, he's back on Capitol Hill today, testifying in the Senate Intelligence Committee. They called him back in part because they're trying to figure out whether Donald Trump Jr. Was telling the truth about how much his father knew about that offer from the Russians and that subsequent meeting with the Russians to get dirt on Trump's presidential campaign opponent. And this situation here presents a couple of particular difficulties for the president and his family. I mean, first of all, there's the question of whether the president's son lied to Congress at any point. Members of Congress have said that they suspect he has done so. So he's back under oath today. There's the question of whether or not he has told any lies that could potentially pose legal jeopardy for him. Secondly, there's the question of whether getting help for a political campaign from a foreign source is illegal, right? How that meets up with the federal laws about what campaigns in this country are allowed to do. I mean, those are questions that tend to stick. Those questions have stuck. If you spent all of your presidency so far dealing with those questions, beating them back, fending them off, you might want to rethink going down that road if the choice got presented to you again. But tonight, when the president himself was asked on tape about his son and the Russian offer of help during the campaign, he was asked by an ABC News anchor in an interview today. The president said something that, once again, is shocking, but this is another one of those things that we will be talking about for a long time to come because this one has reason to stick.
Your son, Don Jr., is up before the Senate Intelligence Committee today. And again, he was not charged with anything. In retrospect, though,
by the way, not only wasn't he charged, if you read it, with all of the horrible fake news, I mean, I was reading that my son was going to go to jail. This is a good young man, that he was going to go to jail.
In June of 2016, just months before the election, Don Jr. received an email from a business associate promising dirt on Hillary Clinton from the Russian government. Don Jr.'s response, "If it's what you say, I love it." The conversation led to a meeting in Trump Tower that included the president's son, his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and a Russian lawyer. Don Jr. insists nothing came of it. And special counsel Robert Mueller concluded there was not enough evidence to charge a conspiracy between the Trump campaign and Russia.
And then the report comes out, and they didn't even say, they hardly even talked about it.
Should he have gone to the FBI when he got that email?
Okay, let's put yourself in a position. You're a congressman. Somebody comes up and says, "Hey, I have information on your opponent." Do you call the FBI? I don't think.
Coming from
I'll tell you
Russia,
what,
you do.
I've seen a lot of things over my life. I don't think in my whole life I've ever called the FBI. in my whole life. You don't call the FBI. You throw somebody out of your office. You do whatever
Al
you do.
Gore got a stolen briefing book. He called the FBI.
Well, that's different. A stolen briefing book. This isn't a stolen. This is somebody that said, we have information on your opponent. Oh, let me call the FBI. Give me a break. Life doesn't work that way.
The FBI director says that's what should happen.
The FBI director is wrong.
Your campaign this time around, if foreigners, if Russia, if China, if someone else offers you information on an opponent, should they accept it or should they call the FBI?
I think maybe you do both. I think you might want to listen. There's nothing wrong with listening. If somebody called from a country, Norway, we have information on your opponent. Oh, I think I'd want to hear it.
You want that kind of interference in our elections?
It's not an interference. They have information. I think I'd take it. If I thought there was something wrong, I'd go maybe to the FBI if I thought there was something wrong.
If I thought there was something wrong about getting help from a foreign country with my election, if I thought there was something wrong with it, maybe I'd go to the FBI. If I thought there was something wrong about it, but I'd want to see what any other country was offering. Call the FBI. Who says you have to call the FBI? The FBI director says that you have to call the FBI. Well, the FBI director's wrong. I mean, this is not the president riding around on the Access Hollywood bus saying, grab him by the genitals, I can get away with it, I'm famous, and then the tape comes out. I mean, this is the president saying on tape, the president who's been saying, no collusion, no collusion. The Russians were trying to help me? Well, I didn't, that wasn't me. This is that same president saying, yes, I would want to see information from a foreign power. Never mind the FBI director's opinion about that. I mean, again, it's not like this is a hypothetical concept that has never come up before. I mean, literally today in Congress, in the Intelligence Committee, even the Republicans' witness, who the Republicans brought in to try to discredit the whole Russia investigation, even that witness brought in by the Republicans today conceded in the Intelligence Committee literally today that, if a foreign government comes to you with something, you've got to call the FBI.
Putting yourself in the place of those who received those contacts, at any of those points, would you have called the FBI?
Well, I would have. Would I have called the FBI?
Yes.
I call the FBI for things probably a lot less serious than that, I imagine. But
thank you.
I do think.
However else you feel about the report, do you think someone should have called the FBI?
Yes.
Thank you.
I think there's no question, and my colleagues here have worked counterintelligence, I'm certain would tell you, we always want information, any information that would be helpful to us in apprising what the likely intentions of potentially hostile powers are.
You're here called by the Republicans to undermine the whole Russia investigation and the whole Mueller report specifically, but even you admit that when they got contacted by the Russians, they should have called the FBI. Yes, of course they should have called the FBI. Yes, you call the FBI. You don't take stuff for your campaign from the Russians. Of course you call the FBI, says the guy the Republicans called today as their expert witness to try to undermine the whole Russia investigation. But as it turns out, what he asserted there about his colleagues who worked in counterintelligence, they did certainly agree with him that, yeah, you don't take stuff from a foreign country. If a foreign country comes to you with something to help you in your campaign, you go to the FBI.
What counterintelligence risk exists when a campaign uses this information about a political opponent that was stolen and released by a foreign adversary? Mr. Anderson.
Thank you, sir. First of all, it troubles me that no one, if they did not communicate this type of information to some government agency just because of the facts laid out in the report and what you just brought up. And individuals that are giving information, as Stephanie said, are being tasked and then receiving information, that is the initial way that you vet any asset or any person that you're targeting for a possible either unwitting asset or recruitment in the future.
I'd just like to add, I think if you're a foreign power and you have a campaign or individuals who are willing to entertain receiving information that you are collecting for their benefit, I think that is a tacit approval of that action. And I think that's where we have to be careful of allowing people to communicate to either a foreign government, a foreign actor, that what they're doing, which is illegal by hacking and collecting information and then releasing it, Giving that kind of approval by a head nod or a suggestion or any kind of inference that it's okay is a tacit approval of that kind of behavior. And I think that puts us at greater risk.
That puts us at greater risk. Literally today in Congress, there are former senior counterintelligence officials from the FBI warning about how dangerous it is as a national security matter for a campaign to take information surreptitiously shopped to them from a foreign government. Yeah, that's how you compromise people in the U.S. government. That's how a foreign government, particularly a hostile foreign adversary, would compromise people in the U.S. government. That's how a hostile foreign adversary would conceivably get power over our government. And, of course, over our elections. But when the sitting president said today, yeah, he'd happily take derogatory information on an opponent from a foreign government in the next election, and no, he wouldn't call the FBI. It's interesting. The president, in making those remarks today, he was also fleshing out what the special counsel Robert Mueller investigated as to the potential criminality of the president's campaign taking a meeting in the summer of 2016 at Trump Tower to accept supposed dirt on the Hillary Clinton campaign that was being offered to them by the Russian government. I mean, Mueller investigated that as a potentially criminal act by Trump and his campaign. And in explaining what they found when they investigated that acceptance of an offer of information from the Russian government, Mueller and his team wrote this. Quote, the communications setting up the meeting and the attendance by high-level campaign representatives support an inference that the Trump campaign anticipated receiving derogatory documents and information from official Russian sources that could assist candidate Trump's electoral prospects. This series of events could implicate the federal election law ban on contributions and donations from foreign nationals. The special counsel's office considered whether this evidence would establish a conspiracy to violate the foreign contributions ban, the solicitation of an illegal foreign source contribution, or the acceptance or receipt of an express or implied promise to make a foreign source contribution. Quote, there are reasonable arguments that the offered information would constitute a thing of value within the meaning of these provisions. However, the office determined that the government would not likely to be able to obtain and sustain a conviction on these counts. And why would they not be able to obtain and sustain a conviction for the behavior around the Trump Tower meeting that the upper echelons of the Trump campaign took in June 2016 when the Russian government came to them and said, hey, we've got dirt on Hillary, you want some? Why did they not think they could obtain and sustain a conviction for that behavior by the Trump campaign? Well, they said there was a big problem with potentially trying to bring charges about that. The big problem is that they, quote, did not obtain admissible evidence likely to meet the government's burden to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that these individuals from the Trump campaign acted willfully, i.e., with general knowledge of the illegality of their conduct. Quote, to prove that a defendant acted knowingly and willfully, the government would have to show that the defendant had general knowledge that his conduct was unlawful. Quote, on the facts here, the government would be unlikely to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the June 9th meeting participants had general knowledge that their conduct was unlawful. The investigation has not developed evidence that the participants in the meeting were familiar with the foreign contribution ban. Yeah, so when the Trump campaign accepted that offer of foreign assistance from Russia back in June 2016, you know what their best defense is? They were a bunch of political newbies. Right? Why would they know that there's some obscure little law against accepting help from a foreign government in your campaign? How could they know? It's not like that had ever been a controversial thing. It's not like any of them had ever been asked about something like that or ever had to worry about something like that. Back in June 2016, Mueller's office concluded they couldn't have known, or at least we couldn't have proven that they knew, that these people in the Trump campaign knew taking dirt like that, taking anything of value for their campaign from the Russians would be illegal. How could they have known back in June of 2016? Well, now, of course, I mean, now they'd have to know. Right now, after all of this controversy, now, if those guys set out to accept something from their campaign from a foreign country, now, obviously, they would know that sort of thing is illegal given the past few years of controversy over this matter. Now they'd know. Now, if they did it, prosecutors would have no problem proving that they had criminal intent if they did it. If that prospect came up, say, today on ABC News.
This is somebody that said, we have information on your opponent. Oh, let me call the FBI. Give me a break. Life doesn't work that way.
The president tonight promising that he would happily take illegal campaign contributions in the form of dirt on an opponent from a foreign government. And no, he wouldn't call the FBI, which is direct, irrefutable evidence on tape of criminal intent, right? That's the criminal intent that Mueller said he couldn't quite nail down the last time Trump's campaign actually did take help from a foreign country. But now there it is out loud on tape as he is promising to do it again in the next election. Joining us now is Congressman Adam Schiff, the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. Sir, thanks very much for being here. Really appreciate your time.
Great to be with you.
So what is your reaction to this news tonight in which President Trump said he wouldn't call the FBI if he was approached by a foreign country with information he could use on his 2020 opponent? He might accept that information. He says FBI Director Chris Wray is wrong if he thinks the correct thing to do there would be to call the FBI.
Well, like many things with Donald Trump, at first you're shocked, and then, of course, you realize, yes, that's exactly him. There is no ethical standard. There is no bar below which he will not go. What I find so striking about this is he went to such trouble to deceive the country about that Trump Tower meeting. He dictated that false statement about adoptions to mislead people. So if this was so perfectly okay as he would have us believe, then why did he go to such trouble to deceive the country about that meeting? I think what the president is really saying is, yeah, I knew this was unethical and maybe illegal, and I would do it again. Plainly, I think we are going to have to spell it out crystal clear in the law that getting dirt from a foreign power is considered a prohibited foreign contribution to a campaign. We could call it the Donald Trump Act if we need any further clarity. But plainly, he hasn't learned the lesson. Rudy Giuliani is going off to Ukraine, or was going to go off to Ukraine, to see if they could drum up some more dirt on one of the president's opponents. Giuliani certainly, as the president's lawyer, hasn't learned a thing. Jared Kushner also wouldn't commit to notifying the FBI if he was contacted in this way. They plainly have learned nothing from these 2.5 years of our exploration of this and of all the public censure around this.
Do you think there's a possibility that the president is essentially, in doing this interview the way that he did tonight, is essentially inviting interference by other countries, that he's welcoming anything that other countries might want to dish up for him on any of his potential 2020 opponents? It seems sort of like a strange thing to ask, but we know from Mueller's report that after the president did solicit hacking assistance in his campaign in 2016 from the Russian government was in fact listening, and within 5 hours of him making that public proclamation, they did mount their first attempt on trying to access Hillary Clinton's private email server. Do you think the president could potentially be asking for what he wants here?
Well, I think without a question, that's going to be the effect of this. Foreign nations, particularly our adversaries, watch every word said by the President of the United States, and they analyze it. What does this mean? And if you take two things the President recently said, one in his conversation with Putin, where he said he still thinks this whole Russia intervention on our election was a hoax. And if you combine it today with him saying, I wouldn't necessarily call the FBI if the Russians offered me dirt again, you put two and two together and the Russians know as long as they intervene on Trump's behalf, he is too weak to ever call them out, and he may even be grateful for it. So yes, I think it gives a green light to other nations to once again interfere in our election.
If the president's remarks tonight are to be taken literally and seriously, when he was confronted by George Stephanopoulos, who said the FBI director says that you should contact the FBI if a foreign government offers to intercede in an election or provide you something of value in an election. The president responded bluntly to that by saying the FBI director is wrong. In terms of the independence of the FBI, the independence of the Justice Department, the president's role as the head of the executive branch, is that potentially the president giving a directive to the FBI that something like that shouldn't be prosecuted?
Look, I have faith that Christopher Wray is a person of principle, and he is going to speak truth to power, as he did when he was asked that question before. I'm sure he knew that this was going to be anathema to the president's ears, but he is absolutely right. that should be reported to the FBI. So I have confidence that he will continue to run the FBI properly. But others may be influenced by Donald Trump wearing them down, battering them down, urging them to do unethical things. It does take a toll. And I think you see in actions of the administration, unethical actions by others in the administration, that they're following the president's example. We saw in our own committee just last week, we did a hearing on the national security implications of climate change. And we found out after the hearing that no written testimony was provided by one of the witnesses because the White House tried to censor the references to a tipping point and references to the cataclysm of climate change. So it does have an effect on those who are too weak to stand up to the president. I don't think Christopher Wray is one of them.
Congressman, I'm interested to hear you talk about FBI Director Chris Wray in that way, particularly because you suggested today that he and his agency may be about to receive a subpoena from you. If you can hold on for just one moment, I'd like to ask you about that on the other side of the break.
Sure.
Congressman Adam Schiff is the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. He is right in the middle of it in about 10 different ways today. We'll be right back with him right after this. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.